No one in Redstone believed a woman could ride through hell and still stand tall, but Annie Callahan did. The late summer sun scorched the dusty streets of Redstone, a small prairie town where the wind carried the sharp scent of sagebrush and the tang of hot iron from the blacksmith's forge. The wooden buildings squinted under the relentless glare, their shadows stretching thin across the boardwalks. In the distance, a lone rider emerged, her broad frame outlined against the endless golden waves of the plains. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen miles of trail and hardship, yet the rhythm of her approach held a quiet, unshakable purpose. Her name was Annie Callahan, a former wagon trail scout whose hands were calloused from years of loading wagons and fending off danger. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. Not the glint of a horse's bit, the sway of a tumbleweed, or the subtle shift of a weathered townsman's gaze. Rumors followed her like dust on a summer wind, tales of narrow escapes, hidden caches, and feats so daring they seemed impossible. But those who met her in person found her presence even more commanding than the legends suggested. As she dismounted, her boots thudded softly against the worn boards of the main street, echoing through the quiet town. A hush fell over the few locals who had gathered, their curiosity barely masked by polite distance. From the saloon, a rough voice called, "Ain't seen a woman like you in these parts before?" Annie's lips lifted into a faint, knowing smile, a curve that held both welcome and warning. She let her gaze sweep the street, taking in the dry, sun-bleached facades, the rusty hitching posts, the children peeking from behind crates. Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment, carrying hints of past storms and old secrets. Beneath the warm, dusty air lingered something intangible, a sense of suspense, the feeling that the town, and perhaps Annie herself, was standing on the edge of change. Every step she took promised that stories long buried would surface, that challenges unseen would demand courage, and that connections forged here might alter more than just her own destiny. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe to Dust and Destiny now and ride with us to the very end. Annie Callahan's first steps in Redstone were small, deliberate, yet spoke volumes about the woman she was. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, amber shadows across the dusty streets, and the town seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, for the newcomer whose reputation had preceded her. Her first destination was the general store, a modest building with faded wooden siding and a bell that jingled whenever the door opened. It was a place of necessity, but for Annie, it was a stage where the subtle truths of her character would quietly reveal themselves. As she stepped inside, the scent of cured leather, dried herbs, and the faint tang of gun oil mingled in the warm, dry air. Her broad frame moved with a deliberate grace, each motion precise yet unassuming. She scanned the shelves with an experienced eye, noting the quality of each item, the sturdiness of leather harnesses, the balance of hand-forged knives, the tight seals on tin cans of beans and coffee. Every clerk, every customer could feel the weight of her attention. It wasn't just about survival, it was about presence, about the quiet command of a person accustomed to navigating a world that often underestimated her. A young boy behind the counter tried to appear busy, but his gaze kept drifting to her hands, calloused and confident, as they brushed over straps and tools. Annie noticed, and a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but she said nothing. Her focus remained on her choices, deliberate and meticulous, each selection a reflection of her independence and practicality. It was not merely shopping, it was preparation, a subtle declaration that she belonged here as much as anyone else in the town. It was near the counter that she first met Elias, the rancher whose reputation for quiet persistence and unshakable integrity had made him something of a fixture in Redstone. He was tall, wiry, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that seemed to measure everything twice before passing judgment. He had been standing by the doorway, hat tilted low, listening to the murmurs of townsfolk who whispered of Annie's arrival. He had heard enough tales of her size, her strength, her uncanny ability to survive hardships that would have broken most men, and curiosity had brought him forward. "You planning to stay long, miss?" Elias asked, his voice low but steady, carrying the hint of humor that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. He didn't approach with bravado. His presence was quiet, like a river carving its path over decades. "As long as the prairie allows," Annie replied, her voice calm, measured, yet resolute. Her gaze met his for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent assessment that balanced caution with curiosity. She weighed not just his words, but the tone, the subtle posture, the honesty in his eyes. There was no rush in her answer, no need to overstate her intentions. She spoke only what was true, leaving the rest for the unfolding journey. Their conversation, brief as it was, set the stage for a relationship that would grow in layers of trust, unspoken respect, and gradual revelation. Elias, who had seen many strangers pass through Redstone, found himself intrigued by this woman whose presence filled the room without effort, whose quiet confidence spoke louder than any boast. Annie, for her part, noted the steadiness in him, the way he moved through the world without unnecessary aggression, yet with a sense of responsibility that commanded attention. Their exchange, though polite and restrained, carried undercurrents of humor, challenge, and mutual recognition, a subtle dance that hinted at future connection. As Annie moved through the store, selecting items with care, townsfolk watched with a mix of admiration, curiosity, and unease. There was something different about her, something that challenged their understanding of strength, of resilience, of what it meant to be a woman in a place where rough hands and hard work defined character. She handled each choice with intentionality. A sack of flour, the weight of it in her hands like a test. A coiled rope checked for fraying and strength. A well-worn rifle polished and ready. Her actions spoke of preparedness, but also of someone accustomed to making choices under pressure, who had learned the hard way that survival demanded foresight, courage, and patience. By the time she left the store, the first layer of trust had quietly formed. Not just with Elias, but with the town. She had not demanded respect, nor had she sought attention. She had simply moved through the space with the clarity and purpose of someone who understood both danger and opportunity. And in that subtle, almost imperceptible way, she began to weave herself into Redstone's fabric, leaving an impression that would grow stronger with every decision, every interaction. Annie's choices, though mundane on the surface, carried deeper meaning. Each step was a declaration. She belonged here, she was capable, and she would face whatever came next with determination and integrity. The audience, following her through these simple yet telling actions, could sense the quiet tension in her journey, the balance of vulnerability and power, independence and connection, secrecy and revelation. It was the first thread in a tapestry of grit, courage, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of a life reclaimed from the shadows of past hardships. By the evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long, golden shadows over the prairie, Annie paused outside the general store, supplies stacked neatly on her horse. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe in the scent of dry earth and sage, the warmth of the fading sun on her skin. The choices she had made today were the first of many, small acts that would ripple outward, setting the stage for trust, confrontation, and perhaps, somewhere on this vast, dusty horizon, an unexpected connection. The prairie stretched endlessly under the late morning sun, a canvas of golden grasses swaying in the hot wind, dust curling in lazy spirals from the hooves of horses and the occasional gust that swept across the open fields. Annie Callahan had begun her day on Elias's ranch with the quiet determination that had always defined her. The tasks were simple yet physically demanding, hauling heavy bales of hay, repairing weathered fences, checking the water troughs for the cattle that roamed the pastures. But for Annie, they were also opportunities to observe, to measure, to integrate herself into a world she had once avoided, a town she had arrived in cautiously, and a man whose quiet steadiness fascinated her. Side by side, Annie and Elias moved through the rhythm of ranch life. The sounds of labor, wood striking wood, rope coiling and uncoiling, the occasional grunt of exertion, forming a tacit melody that underscored the growing connection between them. Elias, whose life had been measured in seasons, storms, and stubborn livestock, noted the precision in Annie's movements. The way she shifted weight to protect her back when lifting, the keen eye she kept on every nail and knot. Every motion was purposeful, and yet there was a subtle grace that suggested experience beyond the ordinary, experience that had been forged in the crucible of trials most townsfolk could scarcely imagine. As they worked, Annie's mind wandered, swept by memories as vivid and unpredictable as the prairie wind. The smell of freshly turned earth after a brief summer shower reminded her of the trails she had once crossed in faraway territories, of the creeks she had followed to find hidden water, and of nights spent under star-filled skies that stretched wider than any horizon she had ever known. She recalled the sound of rushing water, the distant call of a hawk, and the quiet laughter of companions long gone. Friends who had been lost to circumstance, danger, or simply the relentless march of time appeared in her thoughts like ghostly echoes, brief flashes of warmth amid shadows of survival. These memories were neither burdensome nor mournful. They were the lifeblood of her resilience. Each recollection reminded her of what she had endured, what she had overcome, and what she had learned about trust, courage, and the delicate art of reading the intentions of others. She caught herself smiling faintly at a memory of a comrade who had insisted on carrying her pack during one particularly grueling mountain crossing, a small act of kindness that had left a lasting impression, even as she recalled the dangers that had followed. Elias noticed the quiet shifts in her expression, the furrow of her brow, the distant gaze, the half-smile that suggested remembrance. He did not press, did not ask the questions that might shatter the delicate balance she maintained between past and present. Instead, he worked alongside her, respecting the rhythm she seemed to need. There was understanding in silence, a mutual respect for personal history, and an acknowledgement that some scars, visible or invisible, required space to breathe. Their conversations were minimal but charged with subtext. A shared glance when a fence post stubbornly refused to align, a nod in agreement when hauling the heaviest bales. Even the occasional fleeting smile carried layers of meaning. The audience could sense the tension of unspoken histories weaving between them, the quiet suggestion that perhaps, in another time or place, their paths had brushed together before. There was a magnetic pull in the familiarity that neither dared acknowledge aloud, but which lingered in the spaces between words and gestures. Annie's hands were calloused from years of labor, but as she worked alongside Elias, she found herself noticing the steadiness in his, the kind of hands that had built, repaired, and cared for generations. It was in the subtle differences, the way he handled rope, how he braced for a heavy load, the way he watched the cattle, that she sensed reliability, strength, and a patience honed by experience. She compared it unconsciously to her own, measuring skill against skill, strength against strength, but also recognizing something deeper, a kindred spirit, someone who understood endurance, responsibility, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. The prairie itself seemed to encourage reflection. The wind whispered through tall grasses, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant juniper. A hawk circled overhead, silhouetted against the sun, a silent observer of their toil. The sound of a distant creek, hidden behind a bend in the pasture, mingled with the rhythmic calls of cattle, bringing with it a resonance that tugged at Annie's memories. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the heat on her skin, the pull of wind in her hair, and allowed herself to drift for a moment into the echoes of her past, where moments of joy and sorrow intertwined, and where faces and names long forgotten resurfaced with startling clarity. Elias sensed the subtle shifts in her mood. He did not comment, did not intrude. He simply continued his work, allowing her the space to navigate her internal landscape. There was a quiet intelligence in his approach, an understanding that connection could not be forced, that trust, like the fences they were mending, required careful construction and attention to detail. He offered the occasional word of encouragement, a shared joke when the sun bore down too fiercely, but always respected the rhythm she set. Through shared labor, fleeting smiles, and silent moments of mutual respect, the bond between them began to take shape. It was not rushed, not declared, but rather built incrementally, like layers of sediment forming over years in a riverbed. The audience could sense the subtle dance between past and present, the tension of histories that lingered unspoken, and the quiet intimacy of two people discovering alignment in rhythm, purpose, and spirit. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the temperature cooled slightly from its relentless midday heat, Annie paused, leaning against a freshly repaired fence post. Sweat dampened her hair, and dust clung to her skin, yet there was a sense of satisfaction, a rare stillness that came from both work well done and the comfort of shared presence. Elias, standing nearby, adjusted his hat and glanced at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. It was in that unspoken moment, the way their eyes met, the faint acknowledgement of shared understanding, that the subtle truth emerged. Paths had perhaps crossed long ago, threads of their lives interwoven by circumstance, fate, or the unseen hand of destiny. The day ended not with revelation, but with the promise of one to come. The audience, following Annie and Elias through the rhythm of ranch life, could feel the quiet tension of potential discovery, the layered interplay of memory and connection, and the subtle shaping of trust that would anchor the next chapter of their journey. Here, amid the golden prairie, under the endless sky, the past whispered to the present, and the bonds of human resilience, understanding, and silent kinship began to take root. The prairie air had cooled into a gentle evening, the heat of the day replaced by a soft, lingering warmth that clung to the wide-open landscape. The sky was painted with streaks of amber and rose, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rolling fields of redstone. Annie had spent the day on the ranch as usual, hauling the last bales of hay and ensuring the livestock were safely tucked in for the night. But as the day faded, a restlessness settled over her, an old unease that she could no longer ignore. There were letters she had kept hidden, tucked away in the folds of a worn leather satchel, remnants of a past she had carefully compartmentalized, a past she had survived but never truly confronted. With lantern in hand, she returned to the small cabin she had rented at the edge of town, its wooden walls steeped in the scent of pine and the faint tang of horses from the nearby stable. The lantern's glow painted the room in soft amber hues, flickering across the plain walls and throwing shadows that danced in quiet rhythm. She knelt beside the satchel and retrieved a folded piece of parchment, the edges yellowed with age. The handwriting was unmistakable, deliberate, elegant, but laden with the weight of words that had once cut her deeply. Annie unfolded it carefully, her fingers brushing over each line as if to trace the memory itself. The letter spoke of betrayal and loss, of promises broken and consequences that had rippled through her life in ways she had only partially acknowledged. It referenced a friend she had trusted, someone she had followed through dangerous trails and treacherous towns, only to find that loyalty had been a facade. The words were sharp yet tinged with regret, recounting events that had led to isolation, hardship, and the necessity of forging her own path through a world that rarely favored those who dared to challenge it. It spoke, too, of a promise, one she had made to herself long ago, to survive, to endure, and to claim her own destiny despite the betrayals she had faced. Annie's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter, the weight of it pressing not just on her palms, but on her chest. She had carried these words, these memories for years, shaping her strength and her independence, yet never allowing anyone to see the full depth of her scars. Tonight, however, there was a quiet insistence in her heart that demanded honesty, that demanded sharing the truth with the one person who had begun to understand her without question or judgment. Elias arrived quietly, having noticed the flickering lantern through the cabin window. He entered without announcement, carrying the calm confidence that had drawn her attention from the moment they met. He placed a hand lightly on the doorframe, observing her in the warm glow of the lantern, noticing the tension in her shoulders and the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Without hesitation, Annie met his gaze. There was no dramatics, no raised voice or dramatic pause, only the quiet, deliberate decision to reveal herself fully. "I've carried this too long," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's time someone knew." She handed him the letter, watching as his eyes scanned the familiar handwriting and absorbed the story of her past, the betrayals, the dangers, and the hardships that had forged her into the woman he now knew. He listened without interruption, without judgment, allowing the words to settle between them like the dust of the prairie outside, fine and pervasive, yet grounding. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, carrying both warmth and authority. "Your past doesn't define you," he said, "but it can teach you how to live now." His eyes softened as he added, "The strength you have, the courage to face what's left unsaid, is what defines you." For the first time in years, Annie allowed herself to relax, to let the weight of unspoken stories ease from her shoulders. The cabin, quiet except for the soft crackle of the lantern flame and the distant rustle of trees in the evening breeze, became a sanctuary for truth. There was no need for pity, no need for explanation beyond what she had offered. The act of sharing, of unburdening herself, was enough. She spoke of moments she had never told another soul, the fear of being left behind on a trail in the Rockies, the quiet anguish of watching a friend betray her trust, the small victories that had kept her going when the nights were long and the cold unforgiving. Elias listened, nodding, interjecting only to offer a comforting word or a brief, understanding smile. There was a rhythm to their exchange, a balance of vulnerability and acceptance that neither had experienced with another person before. Annie felt the quiet shift within herself, a subtle uncoiling of the tightly wound threads of guilt and fear that had governed so much of her life. It was not instant healing, but a first step, a recognition that sharing her truth could be liberating rather than weakening. The scars she bore, both physical and emotional, were marks of survival, not shame. As the lantern's glow flickered against the walls, casting a warm halo around the two of them, a sense of peace settled over the cabin. The wind whispered outside, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant hum of cicadas beginning their nocturnal chorus. It was in this quiet intimacy, in the shared acknowledgement of a past both harrowing and formative, that Annie felt a tentative but profound sense of acceptance, not just from Elias, but from herself. She realized that vulnerability did not equate to weakness, and trust, once carefully extended, could be a bridge between isolation and connection. The weight of the untold stories, heavy for so long, had begun to lift, leaving space for something new, a possibility that the life she had fought so hard to endure could now include not just survival, but companionship, understanding, and even love. Elias, sensing the significance of the moment, offered no grand gestures. Instead, he simply stood beside her, an anchor in the gentle chaos of memory and emotion, his presence steady and unwavering. Together they watched as the last rays of sunlight vanished behind distant hills, leaving a twilight that shimmered with quiet promise. The prairie outside, wide and infinite, seemed to echo the unfolding truth that the past, no matter how cruel or unyielding, need not imprison the present. Annie felt the resonance of that idea, allowing herself to breathe more deeply, to acknowledge the courage it had taken to face her memories and the relief that came from finally being known. In the days that followed, the letter remained in her possession, but lost its power to haunt. It became a reminder of resilience, a testament to the endurance that had carried her through countless trials. And in sharing it with Elias, Annie had forged a bond grounded in authenticity and mutual respect, a bond that promised support, understanding, and perhaps a connection deeper than either had anticipated. Evening after evening, as they sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, she found herself opening more of the past, revealing pieces of her story that had once been locked away. Elias never pressed. He simply received them with a quiet reverence, allowing the narrative of her life to unfold in its own time. There was an intimacy in this shared silence, a comfort in knowing that truth, once spoken, could be met with empathy rather than judgment. And so, as the stars began to scatter across the vast prairie sky, Annie felt a lightness she had not known for years. The past remained, its scars and lessons intact, but it no longer weighed upon her heart. She had accepted the truth of who she had been, and in doing so had made space for who she could become. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a private victory, and the beginning of a journey toward freedom, trust, and a connection that promised healing and perhaps, in time, love. The night deepened, and the soft chorus of crickets and distant hoots of owls filled the prairie air, punctuating the silence that had settled over the cabin. Annie folded the letter carefully and set it aside, yet the echoes of its words lingered in the corners of her mind. Each line seemed to pull forward memories she had tried to bury, moments of betrayal and solitude that had shaped the contours of her life. She spoke more freely now, recounting the first time she had been left behind during a storm on the Western Trail, how she had crawled through mud and rain to survive, and how the weight of loneliness had pressed on her shoulders for months afterward. Elias listened without interruption, his steady presence offering a safe harbor amidst the tide of recollection. He asked questions sparingly, gently nudging her to explore her feelings without forcing them. "You survived that, and yet here you are," he said softly. "You made it through all that, stronger than most could ever imagine." His words carried no pity, only recognition, a validation of her endurance that touched a part of Annie long hardened against trust. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a small laugh, a sound mingling relief and disbelief. "I didn't just survive," she replied, voice quiet but firm. "I learned. Every mile, every misstep, every loss. It taught me something. Even the ones who betrayed me, they were part of the road I had to walk alone." The honesty in her tone seemed to fill the cabin with a kind of warmth that had little to do with the lantern's glow. They spoke late into the night, the conversation meandering between past and present, revealing fragments of Annie's story that had never reached the ears of another soul. She told of fleeting friendships, of moments of kindness that had rekindled hope when the prairie seemed merciless, and of the rare moments when someone had shown her trust and compassion. Elias, in turn, shared bits of his own history, not in the same raw detail, but enough to show that he too understood perseverance and hardship. Each revelation wove a subtle thread of connection between them, a tapestry of resilience and mutual recognition. Annie realized that the act of sharing her truth was transforming her, shaping a new sense of possibility. The letter had once been a chain, binding her to grief and anger. Now it felt like a key, unlocking not only understanding between her and Elias, but also a space within herself where healing could take root. She no longer felt the constant gnawing anxiety of carrying secrets alone. Each word spoken was a step toward freedom, a chance to reclaim ownership of her story and her identity. Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he said, voice imbued with quiet certainty. "Whatever comes next, you won't face it by yourself." Annie felt a swell of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a flicker of hope. The realization that someone could witness her truth without judgment, that someone could honor her strength while acknowledging her pain, was almost overwhelming in its simplicity. The prairie night stretched around them, infinite and calm, the stars reflecting the vastness of possibility. Annie looked out the cabin window, inhaling the scent of dry earth mixed with sage, feeling the open sky above as a reminder of freedom earned through endurance. She thought about the long road she had traveled, the miles walked alone, and the resilience forged in hardship. And now, for the first time in decades, she considered the potential for connection, not as a risk, but as an opportunity for renewal and growth. In the quiet glow of lantern light, Annie understood that acceptance was not passive. It was an active choice, to see the past without fear, to embrace it without resentment, and to step forward into a life defined not by what she had endured, but by what she could become. The letter lay beside her, no longer a source of pain, but a testament to survival and a reminder that even the deepest scars could hold the seeds of healing. Elias remained by her side, silent yet fully present, embodying the trust and stability that she had long sought. As the wind whispered through the trees and the prairie settled into night, Annie felt the first genuine sense of calm she had known in years. It was the quiet of understanding, the serenity of being fully seen, and the subtle thrill of possibility, the kind that only comes when one has faced the darkness and chosen to step into the light. To mark the end of a chapter in her life, Annie reached into her worn leather satchel and drew out a small polished mirror, its frame etched with faint patterns from a distant town she had once passed through. She handed it to Elias with careful hands, their fingers brushing briefly. "It's not just a reflection," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "It's a reminder that we choose how we face what's behind us and how we move forward." Elias turned the mirror in his hands, seeing more than glass. He saw the resilience in Annie's eyes, the evidence of hardships endured and lessons learned. He understood that the gift was more than a token. It was a declaration. She was no longer bound by the shadows of her past. She was claiming the power to shape her own path. The ranch stretched around them in warm, late-afternoon sunlight. Dust motes floated in the golden light, and the horses in their stalls shifted with gentle curiosity. Every movement on the ranch, from stacking hay to mending fences, carried a quiet purpose. Annie and Elias moved together naturally, their hands sometimes meeting during chores, each touch a silent acknowledgement of trust, understanding, and shared strength. Annie placed the mirror on a sunlit shelf near the barn door. "Let it remind us," she said, "that even when the past feels heavy, we can face it, learn from it, and step into what comes next without fear." Elias nodded, sensing the depth of her words. The gesture was not about closing the past off, but about embracing forward motion, marking a visible sign of healing and renewed trust. As they worked, the energy on the ranch subtly shifted. Tasks that once seemed mundane became moments of connection and purpose. Each nail hammered, each bale lifted, each careful stride across the field reflected the choices Annie had made: to trust again, to act with courage, and to honor her own strength while welcoming support from another. The mirror became more than an object. It was a symbol of autonomy, hope, and the quiet joy of shared survival. It reminded them that resilience did not mean isolation, but the courage to see oneself honestly and share that truth with someone who truly respected it. The prairie breeze carried the scent of earth, hay, and sage, wrapping around them as a gentle affirmation of possibility. Annie glanced at Elias, noticing the rare softness in his usually measured expression. In that moment, the mirror reflected not only light, but the future, one built on trust, respect, and choice. Life on the prairie, once harsh and lonely, now seemed full of potential. The past could be acknowledged and honored, yet it would no longer dictate their steps. Together they could move forward, defining a life not by hardship, but by courage, compassion, and the promise of what lay ahead.